Okay, so we now arrive to the very last panel of the day. It's going to be a slightly different format. It's just, well, Sybil and myself, Sybil making the presentation. And we have with us, we have received apologies and disclaimers that some of us here are not artists. And we discovered Sybil by the help of KADIST as we were doing research, because the day I arrived to Paris was the very next day of the burning down at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. And one was hearing all sorts of stories as well as reading all sorts of news reports. And one of the ways of building or rebuilding the Notre Dame and the research that was required to go into it also relied on game designers. The reason being, Assassin's Creed 3, right? I think it was Assassin's Creed 3, a computer game, did such heavy research on the city of Paris and of the Cathedral of Notre Dame that they practically had more information than art historians and architects did. And that led to a game, a computer game of all things, being a source for further research, further information, and a rebuilding of a heritage. Over the past few months, Sybil, Taus, I, the KADIST team, all of us have been in conversation, very lively conversations, because it really does feel like a different world, the world of gaming. And at the same time, the boundary line between realities and games seems to be blurring increasingly. We are separated right now by practically only a glass wall between what's happening outside and what's happening inside. But is that wall really just a screen, kind of like our mobile phone screens, or is something else going on in our relationship with the inside and outside? Are the games an inside world or an outside world is something we also want to think about. So with great pleasure, I would like to introduce Sybil, who is a narrative game designer, which is a term me and Taus also discovered only after meeting Sybil. A writer, a lecturer, specialized in works of fiction, whose work ranges across video games, advertising, television, and print and web. Sybil's going to make a 20-minute presentation followed by a conversation, which I hope all of you will join in, and that will be the day. So with that, Sybil.
Thank you. It's working? Yeah. So the pamphlet that you have that describes what I'm going to talk about is kind of a lie. I'm not so much going to talk about 2 decades of gaming or video game industry as I'm going to describe the start and where we're at now. We've been talking all day about spaces, about virtual spaces, personal spaces, spaces of truth, of interpretations, and it brings a whole spectrum of brilliant minds and interpretations. And what I'd like to talk about now is a very secluded area, a very secluded space that is virtual as well, but that is governed by rules that are computer rules. All the spaces that you've built as artists or as persons are registered as chaotic because you cannot fully understand and control what happens in them. In a video game, it's something that we do control. We have control over the whole system. We know exactly what can be done within the game. There is no notion of chaos. The only chaos that there is actually the player. A book can exist without a reader. It's written, the story is there. Same for a movie, same for most media actually. But a video game cannot exist without a player. That's our specificity. That's what creates our spaces. So if we go back to the beginnings of video games, we could see that video games are a bit, we identify as a new medium and we're not very sure of ourselves. It's like the 70s and we're taking from 2 big brothers, which are books on one hand and movies on the other hand. And because we don't really know what we're doing in terms of building a medium and interactivity, we just copy them. So the first games that exist, so this is Zork in 1977, are going to copy both of them. This is a copy of books. It's an adventure game, what we call interactive fiction. It's a genre that still exists today, but it's very secluded and not very commercially viable. It doesn't make much money. And what you can read here is very computer-based in terms of setting and interactions. It's basically a player that observes the environment around them, chooses to inspect the environment, to throw the environment at themselves, and the games decide that they died from that action. Very arbitrary. There is no way of understanding what's going to happen to you. You just submit it to the text, and your will as a player is not very respected. Well, I hope the player didn't intend to kill themselves this way, because it's a bit of a stupid way to die, but the game decided that's going to happen. So that's the first way we're trying to invest ourselves in copying the big brothers, especially books. We're just going to be a game with text and nothing else. The other Big Brother movies is going to be copied not in the game themselves, but in what we call cinematics, which are basically mini movies inserted within the games, which are spaces where the player cannot do anything. They just watch. Blizzard is the master at this. It's a game editor and developer. What you can see here is a cinematic from World of Warcraft, which you may have heard about. I hope you did, maybe. I don't know how many of you are players or actually interacted with a video game in your life. Could you just show of hands, anyone who played? Or played? Oh my god, that's little. Okay, better than I expected, but still a bit small of a number. So this is World of Warcraft, and Blizzard is very good at making heart-wrenching, gut-splitting cinematics where all the story takes place. We started the notion of cinematics in 1980 with Pac-Man, that you may have also heard about. I'm going really with the basics here to make sure that you can follow me. It was the first game to do cinematics, but we didn't call it that way. We called that intermission, like the spaces within a play, a theatre play, where the spectators actually had time to leave the room and go do their business elsewhere. It was really a space where the player was not expected to do anything, and even leave the game. In these spaces, we would tell about the world of Pac-Man, what the characters do in their spare time. But it was not a space for the player to play. And that, wow, that's loud. And that idea of secluding story space and secluding story itself is still very, very present in video games today. What you can see here is one of the most important moments in Diablo 3, another Blizzard game, where the angel Tyrell chooses to pull out his wings to become human because he doesn't want to be an angel anymore, he doesn't abide by these rules, and the player has no say in it. It just plays on the screen, and if you didn't want Tyrell to be a human, if you wanted him to be an angel, that's your loss. The game decides what the story is. We've tried at the beginning of video games, so that's Monkey Island, we've tried at the beginning of video games of making narrative games. We've tried to bring the player into the story, to give them an agency, an impact of the story itself. So we would do dialogue spaces where you could choose dialogues, but the results will always be the same. It's a fake choice of sorts. And then Mass Effect came, so that was 2007, I think, somewhere around that. And we had the first choice, dialogue choice still, but choice that will have an impact on the story. So here you have something that broke the lives of many players. It was a choice between saving two of your non-player characters' friends, Ashley or Kaiden. And depending on the choice you would make, the other character will actually die. And you will never have access to that character anymore in the subsequent games of the series. There was no way around this other than replaying the game or erasing your save file. It was a real consequence. It was the first one, it was shocking for many. But the players were starting to have an actual impact on the things they would leave. So the question was being asked of, okay, we have these spaces, these dialogues with choices, we have these cinematics, with movies that are being played, these very secluded, strict story spaces. If we remove that, if we take away dialogues, if we take away movies, what remains? Actually, what remains is everything that makes a game. It's interactivity. It's gameplay, it's exploration. You can see an example here on Witcher 3, where you will go through environments where a war took place. No NPC is going to be there to tell you what happens, really. You just see it. You can explore, see the bodies, you can see the impact that the fires have on land, and you can have in other games just basics like fighting. Here you have an example of Skyrim, which is a game that is very adaptive, and that will take every single action you do, including just jumping or walking or anything, and shape your character stats around that. So that every single character, for every single player, is very personal to them. And it's a way that you can build your story as well, that role-playing of an avatar, of a hero inside the virtual world. Through that deduction of trying to see what we can focus on in terms of interactivity and being true to the player, we've defined models that we call determinism models that act on 3 axes. The first one is the environment. You can see here The Division, which was a game that came out in 2016, I think. So we are really beginning to touch games that actually pay attention to what the player does. This is a determinism model of the environment, especially what we call environmental storytelling. We accept the fact that players have real-life knowledge, supposedly. If you enter an environment and you see that big building, it's white, it's got stained glass, it's got a God will save the just banner on top, the architecture is Gothic, you will assume it's a church. You don't need someone to tell it to you. And we know that the players will know that. We accept the fact that you come inside the game with a set of knowledge that we can exploit for the needs of the story. The second axis is the determinism models that we will build with you. We assume that as a developer, we will sign a contract of knowledge with the player, meaning that if I show you something, this something will always be true till the end of the game. And if I break that contract, it's willingly. Here you have Inside, which is a game that came out, I don't know, a couple of years ago, where we teach the player what menaces are in the world without a single line of text. You have an avatar, which is a young kid. You don't know its gender, you don't know why he or she is there, but you know what the enemies are, because when you are close to some presences, like the car in this instance, the avatar will crouch, will start to breathe heavily, will lower the pace, will start to shake a bit. And every time you will see that type of behavior, we are telling the player, this is what your avatar does when there's a menace nearby. And that contract is signed and verified all the way along the game. So we have these models of real life, and we have these models of contract with the player, and then we have models of gameplay. Gameplay is basically every single interaction in the game that can carry meaning, which means everything. In the game Florence, that came out a couple of years ago, basically every interesting thing in terms of narrative design came out between 2013 and this year, so it's a very short range of innovation. In Florence, we present the player with loops of gameplay that will repeat themselves while evolving. So we present them with a reality that will change and carry meaningful gameplay change. The first time you have a conversation gameplay, you have to fit puzzle pieces within a space. It's not complicated, but it's not super easy to do. You have these pieces, same colors, you have to piece them. There's a timer. You're in that setup where your main character is trying to hit on a guy. It's very complicated. You don't know the guy, you're trying to piece the pieces. Okay, then fits, I can go on with the conversation, it's fine. The second time you have a conversation with that guy, because you got to know him, because you know his reflexes and how he talks, the puzzle is super easy. You just have to pick one piece, the other one, and you can talk. It's the way we build metaphors for real life and for meaning through the exploitation of gameplay. Building meaningful gameplay is something that's very important inside video games, because that's the way we can give the player tools to build meaning for themselves. In Life is Strange, the whole theme of the game is about not assuming your choice and learning to assume them, growing up as someone who can accept the choices they made. The main gameplay is about going back in time. You have the same logic of dialogue and choices you make in dialogue, but you can always rewind the choices you make to choose something else, to see what the alternatives are. And the game breaks that contract from time to time by telling you, here you will not rewind. You can only choose once, and it's on you. That logic of questioning the gameplay is basically the main tool we have to communicate with the player, to make them feel that there is meaning in the environment they are exploring. Here you can see Undertale, which was a game that came out 2 or 3 years ago, where one of the characters will actually take and break the interface, because the character that you can see on screen does not want to fight. The whole game is built around the notion of questioning the player on their habits. This is an RPG, okay, but have you considered the impact you have on the characters you killed? Have you considered the impact you have as someone who considers that fighting is the only option? And the whole game is built around that, and it's gained massive fandom because it's one of the few games that actually questions the player for what they are and the actions they do. And it's a whole movement. It's something that we do more and more for games, rarely for mainstream games. It's very hard when you're not a player, not inside video games themselves, to find these games, but they do exist. On the left, you have Stanley's Parable, which is a game where a narrator will tell you what to do, and you can strictly follow what they tell you to do. But the game will not evolve if you keep on following orders. The game is waiting for you to break the rules. And the narrator will react to that, like, what are you doing right now? I told you to go left, you chose to go right. Are you sure there's no game behind that door? And there is, obviously, because the developer built something in anticipation of the player's disbelief of the orders. The second one is also something that counts on the player being a human being, basically. It's her story. It's a game that is kind of a police thriller. You have that search engine where you can type basically any word, and it will give you videos, extracts of interview of someone who killed, apparently, another being. And these puzzle pieces, these small videos, are numerous. There are 200 of them. And the order in which you will discover them will always tell a different story. If you ask 2 different players of her story, you will never get the same idea of something that is basically the same sources. But the way in which, the order in which you'll discover these pieces will shape your own interpretation of the story. So there again, there is a way of considering the player as themselves and as someone who will experience the game and draw meaning from that experience. We're not treating the player as a hero per se. They're not a superhero. They are a character in a story space, and we're building that space for them. In the last game that you see, Frostpunk, is something that I do not recommend you play if you have depression or any dark thoughts, because it's extremely dark and will question your moral compass heavily. Here you can see one of the choices that you can make in the game, which is to follow or not child labor, which is actually very good for your economy, but will usually crush your moral compass. It will question you through choices that may not have an impact, an actual numeral impact on the game, but will always question yourself as a being. That consideration of the player, besides moral compass, will extend to slowly the space of the player themselves. In Brothers, Tale of Two Sons, which came out, I don't know, 5 years ago, maybe 6, we are considering the interface that the players use to interact with the game, not just the player themselves. We're going beyond that. In these games, you control 2 characters, a little brother and a bigger brother, and each of your hands controlling 1 character. When one of these 2 brothers, this is a spoiler, I'm sorry, when one of the 2 brothers dies, you're left with just 1 hand on your controller, trying to hold the weight of the whole thing. And a little bit later in the game, you can actually use both hands to control 1 character, effectively saying that you've come up with your grief, you've done your mourning, and you can accept the fact that your brother is gone. On a lighter note, we've gone through the exploration of the player space beyond just the home or the hearth where you play. Pokemon Go is a very good example of that. We use the actual real life as the stage for the game. We use mapping, GPS tracking, to map the game on a world that is real. Augmented reality and virtual reality are ways that we can build tools around the consideration, not just of the player, but the player space itself. And by doing that, we blur the limits between what is a game and what real life is. In the first year of Pokemon Go, it was a mess, because we will have hundreds of players, flocks of them. In La Villette, it was a nightmare. Just looking for virtual characters that only existed on their screen, but has a physical presence for them. That was actually materialized by the movements of the player in real life. The latest tools that we have is basically virtual reality. It's something that we are in full bloom in terms of technology, especially in terms of real-life mapping. We have the Oculus Quest, which is, I'd say, the biggest advancement in terms of technology that we have. The VR helmet that you wear can take in the environment, map it, and project a game on that environment, so that you can absolutely make no difference between what is real and what is not, besides the low resolution of assets that are projected within the space. But still, it's pretty impressive, and it's something that is very easy to exploit and to develop for. And it goes both ways, because we can develop things for the player space, but players also can develop things for games. What you can see on screen is what is called a posh crab. It's a mod for Skyrim, one of the games I told you earlier. That's actually a player who made that. Modding is a way that we allow players, through safety faults within the games that are completely controlled, to modify the game's content. Basically, we allow them to put anything they want inside the game. We have moderation, of course, to avoid problematic subjects, but basically we allow them to appropriate the space for them to build something that is their own. The Posh Crab was basically a monster in Skyrim, where they put a top hat and a nice and a mustache on them, and then we talk with a British accent. It's a small example, but it can go way beyond that. It can go up to creating characters, 3D models, quests, entire ecosystems of logic that will break what the system has actually put into place. It's a way of allowing the players to take these contracts we've signed with them and break them and change them and share them with all the players. This appropriation of space has gone even beyond that, especially in the terms of esports. What we're talking about right now is more about the player story than the game story, and the difference between the two. The player story is the way you will interact with the game and how you will recount that interaction, what you live through. Not just as an avatar, but as the person who played. And that consideration actually gives the best stories. Esports is amazing in terms of example, because people make actual careers out of playing. This is League of Legends, one of the biggest tournaments for one of the biggest games that exists. It has, this year it was 4 million spectators for a $2 million prize in dollars, actual money. And people make careers out of that. Professional players that train for these competitions, that live for these competitions. And their lives and performance are documented and followed by other players, because it's the most amazing player story, because it's defined by the game itself. So what we have now is that kind of new ecosystem of interactivity, where we consider the players not just as players, but as more than that. We consider them as actors for the game itself, but as creators of content, and more importantly, future creators of content. The players of today are going to be the developers of tomorrow, and we have that need and that right to educate them for future interactions, future creations of worlds, and hopefully future games that will keep on building a player story. And that's it.
Thank you, Sybil. Somewhere in the beginning of your presentation, there was a massive storm outside of protesters and practically what looked like riot police force with shields running. It was surreal. I don't know if all of you noticed it. And it's wrong. Like everything, I mean, someone seeing this now would not even be able to tell this happened literally 10 minutes ago. Yeah, so I'm still a bit disoriented, to be honest.
It's fine, it's Paris, it's typical Saturday.
But so, thank you for the presentation. We've been in many conversations already, but and I hope you don't mind me practically asking some things that I asked you back then, which are maybe you could share with us something a little more about where you started off with the player being the anomaly. The chaotic element is the player in all of this, and but that also necessitated that games still require players. But in the looming world of artificial intelligence and second nature, do games really need players? Or the upcoming games?
Without players, it's not a game anymore. But you can question that. There's been a game that's called Mountain that you could play. It's very easy in terms of interactions. It's basically a game that's idle. You launch it on your computer, and it's a mountain, much like this one actually, that just lives without you. And as a player, you can choose to interact with it and modify its state, but the game will live with or without you. It's just that you consider there is a player as long as you launch the thing. The same could be true of a movie, for instance, but it exists that to maybe be interacted with. The fact that you anticipate interactivity is what makes it a game, more than actual interactivity within the medium. That's my opinion. People will say that's not true.
And then I wanted to come to another question, which is that increasingly games have required more and more information about the player. Oftentimes ID kind of registration. And this brings up all kinds of ethical questions as to how much information goes into games in order for the player to remain an agent or be subsumed entirely into a game beyond just the interface.
It depends what you do with that info. Like, to be honest with you, most of the times it's not the will of the developer to take that info, it's the publisher that does that. So the person who gives us the money to make the games, basically, and we have no control over what we take from the players. But some games will actually use info to make it better, especially metafictional games that treat the player as the entity they are. That we will use your name, we will use your computer, we will use the space outside of the game, and that makes a very specific link with the player. One game that was groundbreaking for that was, the name is there with me, the Doki Doki Literature Club. Doki Doki as in heartbeat. Heartbeat. So it's presented as a dating sim for guys. It's very cute, big eyes, huge Japanese style. But when you play it, you realize that it's super bleak, extremely dark, and it will talk to you using your name, whatever nickname you used within the game. It will retrieve info from your Steam account to personalize the experience, and you will have to leave the game to modify its actual game files to make sure that the story goes in a specific direction. And the game has an enormous amount of endings, and fulfilling these endings allow you to unlock new content within the game. And that idea of considering the player for who they are is something that's very interesting in terms of game design, of creating a new ecosystem of interactivity around the player. The fact of taking data to sell it is not very creatively interesting, but you can build even political games around that notion. We can bring messages and we can bring interactions through that, but most of the time it's just not a choice.
And with oftentimes interfaces starting to shatter, or sometimes interfaces changing at least between games and reality. And as the line between maybe games and reality start to blur, do we remain players or characters, or as you propose, even developers? What does that even mean? Remaining a player, remaining a character, or remaining a developer? Because all of them
are... It's not so much about remaining. It's more about having different roles at the same time, which is totally fine. You can be a player and a character and a developer at the same time. Combining the three of them in terms of game design is an insane amount of work. If you want to do something coherent, which offers that. I have no examples out of the top of my head, but there are probably indie games that play with the idea. The player has always more or less been considered a character, or at least the puppet master of a character. And more we are considering the player as a character of themselves, like the person facing the screen or wearing the helmet or playing on their phone, because it's more interesting this way, simply. Considering the player as a developer is more tricky because you have to challenge the very notion that you are in control of your creation. And it's not an easy thing to do, not just for your ego, which is an argument in of itself, but in terms of building something that is going to stay coherent with your vision and the experience you want to offer. What you can see in the past 10 years is the rise of procedural gameplay, which is basically setting up rules for the gameplay to evolve in contact with the player. So we have two main directions with that. We have content that is generated according to rules, and content that is generated only in the player's mind, that we call emergent gameplay, which is basically emergent. So you have internal rules in a game, things that are fixed and that you as a developer have control over and the player has no control over, and you have external rules that the player will create for themselves. It's like when you play chess, to take a game that is very simple, you have a set of fixed rules, but nothing prevents you from inventing new ones. You will have the possibility of inventing rules or defining new sets of evolution. When you are a seasoned chess player, you know that there are moves that are not interesting, and that's something a newbie will never know. It's a set of rules that you create for yourself for the sake of efficiency.
And I want to also bring up another question related to a very controversial and famous game. I think it was Brenda Romeo's Train. I don't know if all of you have heard of this. This was a game where the objective was to how most ergonomically fill up a compartment of a train with people, and how you can design this compartment. And by the end of the game, you're told that this train is going to Auschwitz. And this, of course, the player never signed up for. And there are more such stories of games in a sort of darker vein of making a player complicit.
I hate that game.
Yes.
With a passion, because there's no contract with the players. It's basically at the end of the game telling them, ha! And that's it. So and the point does not come across at all, because the person who actually did this job knew what they were doing and why. And that agency is completely killed in that game. When you want to make a game that is political and that has a message, you have to be very clear with the player about what you're going to do. Even if what you're going to do is withholding information, you have to be clear about that. And if you don't, you break that trust that the player has in you. And that's super important, because you're basically giving them a whole world to play with, in which they're supposed to masterfully control things. Even if it's like flow breaking, even if the difficulty is too high, you are honest with the things you are offering. Even if the game evolves, you have to be honest about that. That's why, for me, that game is interesting as an experiment, but as a game, I just don't like it.
And this is precisely what I wanted to ask. How do you decide what that contract with the player is going to be? Or how does the industry decide?
That's two different questions. There is a difference between your creative will as a developer and what your publisher thinks is viable in terms of money. That's a long question, long one. I can maybe more talk about my personal experience, because it's multiple answers for that single question. I worked with both indie studios and big-ass developers. Basically, you have two kinds of big publishers. You have the kind that buys your services for the creativity involved and that will allow you a range of creativity within which you can thrive. And you have those who have a specific target. And targeting is something that is both terrible and magnificent in video games. Because it's a way of knowing your audience, their habits, what they like to play, their reflexes. So for us designers, it's knowing the models that they know about. I talked to you about knowing the models for a church, but you can know the models for a shooter, you can know the models for a puzzle game, and that's a knowledge that the player already has while entering the game. So that's very important for us to know that. The problem is when basically marketing teams project on these player models, models that are based on, how to say that, not design relevant specs. Like, this is going to be someone who between 15 and 25 doesn't mean anything for me in terms of design. That's going to be someone with that kind of monetary revenue, that kind of concurrent games they play. Basically info that you cannot really use in terms of creation, but you have to follow. Because for them, it's a way of minimizing risk when it comes to selling the game. It's the entertainment industry that brings the most money. It's more than music, cinema, and I think the NBA combined in terms of revenue. It's enormous, and usually it's budgets that will range between 2 and 2,000 million. So it's not a small risk to take. Lately, God of War was the biggest reboot we've ever had. It's a huge license, so it's a AAA. It's around 80 million in terms of development budget. And there was God of War 1, 2, 3, basically a game where you screw with chicks with big boobs and you slaughter demons. It's a game about redemption. It doesn't really carry the point across. And they did a reboot of the series, and they were asking themselves, okay, the cinematics say it's a game about redemption, it's a game about finding yourselves. How can we do that in the gameplay? And there was a huge, huge wall from marketing about that. Because the target for Game of War was a very specific definition of player. They want violence, they want something that's going to be rated 18 or even more, depending on the country. And we want that, and that's everything we want. We want QTU with sex scenes, and we want blood and gore everywhere. And the team actually pushed against this. It was a major risk, and their careers were on the line. And what came out of this was a masterpiece. They actually took the themes that the story already had and put them in the gameplay. So now you have that guy, same character, who is trying to train his son to be a god like him. And it's a story about bringing up someone while mourning your late wife, while trying to cope with the people who will attack you for the crimes you committed before. And it's very fulfilling. And the players loved it. And it's actually, it was so big in terms of coherence that it drew new players to it. And that's something that's very rare, to have actual new audience come to a game that has a fixed set of targets. And it ranged over 20 years, so that's a huge achievement. And it opened new doors for creatives in the industry as well.
I'm going to open the floor if someone has questions. Sybil, I see some hands already. So, yes?
Well, thank you very much.
Just one second. At the bottom, I think somewhere.
No? Yeah. Well, thanks very much. It was quite fascinating. I have a number of questions. I don't know whether we have time to discuss all of them, and maybe they are quite simple and absolutely relevant. The first one would be, So you spoke about this environmental storytelling and this implicit knowledge of the game player. So this is something which narrative theory explored in the 60s, I think. So is there a kind of exchange between narrative theory and game designers, narrative designers, or is there?
I'd like to say yes,
Yeah.
but the answer is no. We could have a love and hate relationship with researchers, but usually it's just hate. It's mostly people from social studies that study video games, and usually, and because I've worked with researchers myself, it's people who won't play games themselves and try to look at us from a very distant and often judgmental point of view. The problem is that we have that vision of researchers, so we do not reach out to them because they're usually very, how to say that, they're stuck on high horses, and when you work with them, it's very difficult to have to take your design points across, because often you're not taken seriously because it's just video games. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. In The Sims, for instance, or in, I think, EVE Online, there's been work that's been done with economists and narratologists in terms of bringing up new narratologies and new design methods. So it exists, but it's extremely rare because on one side, most researchers that we contact do not want to work with us, and the other side, it's tiring for us to reach out to people that just undermine our work.
Well, thank you. So I'm possibly one of the people you hate, so narratologist myself.
Would you like to work with them? Would you like to work with them?
Yeah, why not? Because this interests me, and maybe the next question, if I ask so.
Do we have others? Oh. Okay. One more for Zal.
One more.
Okay. One more. Quick one. Yeah.
This one, the quick one would be, so you started with this division, you know, between game and other forms of fiction, and you said, you know, books doesn't, if the book is written or film is there, it doesn't need anybody. And in the game, you need the game player. So, what do you think that this border that you have just driven is really as strong?
No, it's another simplification, clearly. It's more a way of getting my point across. I do not believe that currently with the technologies we have and the way we envision media, that we can still draw these lines, especially because we have interactive books or books that exist on online platforms, especially because we have interactive movies, especially because we have movies that are made for their authors and not for a spectator, so that will exist regardless of whether or not there is a spectator. It's an understatement to say that hey, everything is compatible in their little boxes and everything. I do not believe that. It's just an easy way of getting the point across of the game will not exist at all. I know that a book might exist without a reader, same for a movie, but a game, it's absolutely not possible. It's a 0% chance.
Wording our questions.
There's one person right behind. There's one person behind Zal, and then
I'm going to ask a little bit of a provocative question, but games are said to be very addictive, and I think as a designer, you might, the point of the game is to keep the player as long as you can, caught in the story, caught in the scenario. So could you share with us some tricks about how to keep as long as possible this player, like you need to handle this frustration, what are the tricks? I don't speak about the ethical aspect, I would like to know the tricks.
It's a very wide question because it depends on the genre of the game. What you're talking about we call retention. And retention in itself is a design tool, so you might want a player that will not stay long and have multiple sessions on a game. You might want a player that is going to run through all 13 to 30 to 50 to 200 hours of game. It really depends on the genre and the type of player you're targeting. Usually RPG players will put in the numbers, like by large large margin, and it's numbers that you cannot fathom as a developer. You've spent, I don't know, 100 hours playtesting your own game, and you will discover that on Steam, some players will have 800 hours to 1,000 hours in the game. That's insane, but it does exist. It's usually for most premium games not something you're going to target. Premium games are games that you buy and that's it. Freemium games is another model that you will see mostly on mobile, where you're going to not buy the game but just acquire it, download it, and you will buy content inside of the game. So you will need to build your attention around monetization and the way of you can build, how to say that, not just player engagement with the content, but the player need to put money in the game. It's something that's very hard to do well. It's often poor design, but if you can include that in the experience of the player in a way that is not abusive, you can actually build something that is going to last a long time with the players. Some of the longest running games are actually mobile games with very good retention models. You can look at Love Nikki, which is a dress-up game, very accessible, it's on mobile. It's basically a story about a girl in a parallel world and she will compete with clothes. It's very simple, but it's got complexity that you will only see when you are a long-term player. And that layer of interpretation, that's differentiating aspect of the game is usually what's going to drive retention. Like offering players content that they will have access to in the beginning, in the midterm, and in the long term as well. Usually you will play on levels of motivation depending on the player type that you have. So it depends on the studio, but we consider that there are 4 big groups of players. You have the achievers that want everything to be 100% fulfilled within the game. You will have the explorers who just want to go and check everything that the game has to offer that are very hard to keep because once they are done with the exploration of the content, they just leave. You will have the competitors that define the value of the game through its ability of putting forward skills. So you need competitions with other players, not obviously fighting, but you can have competition in scoring, in the way you perform within the game. And the last time are storytellers, which for me is the most interesting file because it's the kind of players that will really build the biggest player story that will actually exist outside of the game. And if you build your design around these 4 models and make sure that everyone finds their feel within the game, you can have, if not the best, at least a better retention of players.
It's a really good question because I often ask this about books. What about book addiction? How do people strategize that? What about us who suffer it? Or conversations? Shubha?
Thank you for this very fascinating presentation. I learned a lot. I have a question which has to do with, partially you answered my question with your typology of the 4 types of players. But my question has to do with, let's say, motivation of the player. And one of the things that has always troubled me with, and I used to read a lot of game theory before. I mean, that's a different world, I know. But what happens in game theory is basically you're asked to take decisions. Right? And the game offers you possibilities, and you choose, like for instance, you choose this character or that, you choose to aid this person or that person. As a person, I am very prone to hesitation. And I'm wondering, and as a reader of novels, for instance, you're not necessarily called upon to produce evaluations immediately of the action or the characters. You proceed and you can revise your decisions. Is there a model where ambiguity and hesitation has a place in the syntax of game design?
Yep.
And I'm not saying just a multiplication of possibilities.
Yeah.
Because all those possibilities are also decisions in themselves.
You will have 2 types. You will have the solution you just described, which is basically branching design, where you will anticipate the decision that the player can make. But you will have also a design that will take into account the hesitations or the lack of decision of the players. Usually it's mostly in narrative games. well, you will account for non-choice as a choice itself, system-wise, because you need to judge what the player does. So you need to consider a lack of action or a hesitation or a not full decision as a decision by itself. It's very interesting to design for this kind of games because you need to build an ecosystem around the hesitation of the players. But it's perceived hesitation for the player. For you as a developer, it's an actual decision, and it goes within the system as an actual decision. So you can have.
How do you index it? Is it time taken or?
It depends on the game. Like you had a lot of Telltale Games, which was a developer that shut down long ago, who had most of its decisions that were time-based. And if you didn't make a decision within that time frame, it would count as a non-decision. And that was actually a right choice to make. You will have, on the way of delayed consequences and hesitations, which are free, that had a narrative system that was very interesting. Basically, the decision that you made, or the lack of decisions you made, or just the decision to not decide yet, have consequences long-term in the story, but you never see it right away. So there's a way of playing with the hesitations of the player and considering them as important as if they actually made a choice. So it's very tricky to build systems for that, extremely difficult, and procedural is a nice way of going about it because hesitation is something so varied and so multiple that you cannot humanly account for everything. So you need to have an AI to do that work for you. But the results in terms of games is usually succulent in terms of narrative.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Maybe last question. Are there more hands? Should we factor in more questions or? Okay, so the last question.
Yes, thank you for this presentation. I recently stopped at Tomb Raider on the video game, so it's been a long time I didn't play, but I wanted to ask you about the moral side. You discussed that about that game, you said Game of War, you just said about the morality about it. Is there a commission, or how does it, is there a limit to the violence? Is there like an organism that says, no, this is too violent, too much sex, or, because I don't know what's the you know, how many games are actually, as you said, they have this morality, they're trying to awaken the consciousness of the player, but it seems to me that the rest are more about entertainment. I don't know what you think about it. Will it change in the future as well?
We have very strict systems for that, but their application depends on the country, sometimes the continent. For instance, in France, we abide by the KADIST system, which is a way of judging the content of the game. It's very strict in terms of what you can or cannot show, say or cannot say, and it gives you a range of basically PEGI 7, PEGI 12, PEGI, I think it's 15 and 18, but I don't work with PEGI, so I can't really tell you. And these are advice for the buyer, but also restrictions for the seller. So you might sadly find sellers that won't follow this rule, which is illegal, but they do it anyway, and we don't really have a control over that. And then it depends on the country. Like the USK, which is the German system, only exists in Germany, is a nightmare to navigate because there are both advice for the buyer of video games and the buyer of board games. And in France, if you're familiar with what we have here, it's basically on board games, we say a number, it's recommended age and up. So you can buy that for kids that are at least 8, and the rest is fine. And the USK has the same logic, but treats it as if it were a restriction. So it will say ages 8 and up, instead of saying this is for player aged 8. So you will have both a frustration for the players and frustration for the developers, because sometimes you will have like 18 like USK 18 on a game that has no gore, no sex, no insults, just because they consider it should be around that age. And there's, how to say that, a fog of war around the criteria that are applied. Basically, it's like huge Excel files huge spreadsheets that you have to fill, and you have to provide screenshots and videos, very detailed extracts of the game to apply for lower ratings. And for the USK, if you just don't feel like filling the 300 tabs of that file, you're automatically 0 or an 18, meaning that you cannot be sold to minors. Japan has its own system, which is a nightmare to navigate as well, but the worst of the worst, so this is very bleak, the worst is the ESRB, which is the American system, and it doesn't make sense, like at all. It basically, if you put a cross or any sign of religion, it's 18 immediately. For them, religion and sex are the worst. But you can have gore and it's going to be 16, it's fine. You can have torture, visual torture, it's going to be 16, maybe 12, because they've seen that in movies, it's fine as well. And you're just like, okay. As a developer, it's super frustrating because we have no control over that. So we can communicate in trailers when the marketing allows that. We can communicate in forums when the non-disclosure agreements you signed allow that. We are very restricted in the way we communicate with players and in the way we can communicate around the contents of the game and what they should expect. But we do try our best to regulate the contents.
Well, it looks like there's usually a lot more of censorship debates happening around cinema, literature, art in various countries, and certain countries stand out as the most sort of authoritative, and clearly the gaming world will tell us a different picture of censorship globally.
Yeah, Chinese markets is...
I mean, we discuss America. We've ended on a very decisive note of the gaming world, of how even hesitation is coded and inbuilt. But we've had a day full of indecisiveness. We've had a day of people with confused identities, with multiple identities, altered states, altered egos. We're ending sort of with immersion into a certain field. We started the day with a kind of a proposition to see ourselves in the various immersions. And it's been a very, very rich day for me at least. I hope all of you have had a good time. Thank you all for staying on.